PVL2601 Case Summary. Ex parte DAO. Facts: applicant wanted marriage declared null and void because the marriage took place in a garden. The judge found nothing wrong with a marriage in a garden and the application failed. This is applicable to prescribed marriage formalities during the ceremony. Void, voidable, and putative marriages. The requirements for a putative, which is an assumed, acknowledged, accepted marriage. Mueller versus Alselbrook. Repeat, Mueller versus Alselbrook. Facts: the applicant and her deceased husband went through marriage ceremony solemnized in accordance with Islamic rites by a priest who was not duly appointed as a marriage officer. Neither spouse was aware of that fact. They had 7 children. The children couldn't inherit from the father because they were seen as born from unmarried parents. The argument was that the marriage was a putative marriage, even though statutory requirements for solemnization of marriage had not been complied with. The application was granted. Applicable to the requirements of or for a putative marriage. Next, the patrimonial consequence of a putative marriage. The patrimonial consequence of a putative marriage. Zulu versus Zulu. The applicant entered into a civil marriage in community of property. The husband already in a civil marriage in community of property with another woman, only discovered at husband's death due to her not knowing. She claimed marriage to be putative and was entitled to half the estate. The court dismissed the application. No matrimonial system can operate in a void marriage. So the conclusion in Zulu versus Zulu was no matrimonial property system can operate. No matrimonial system can operate in a void marriage. Next, household necessaries. The termination of joint household. Household necessaries. The termination of joint household. The case's name is Exal versus Douglas. Exal versus Douglas. The facts deal with the basis of one spouse's liability for goods the other spouse purchased on credit while there was no common household between them. One spouse has capacity to bind other, and if marriage is in community of property, the joint estate for household goods, only if 3 requirements are met. It must be a valid marriage between partners. Parties must share a joint household, and the transaction in question must relate to household necessaries. If the requirements are met, it binds the spouse in contractual nature. But once the joint household comes to an end, one spouse cannot bind another in a contractual nature. Repeat. Once the joint household comes to an end, one spouse cannot bind the other in a contractual nature. The household necessaries. The termination of joint household. Repeat. It's applicable to household necessaries and the termination of joint household. Next. Household necessaries, how it's determined whether something is a household necessary. The case's name is Relumel versus Ramsey. The facts. Factors which have to be taken into account, such as the spouse's standard of living, etc. Should the court take subjective or objective approach? In this case, took subjective, which is viewed from the perspective of the dealer, takes into account factors of which the dealer was aware, ought to have been aware. The objective approach is the court takes into account all factors without paying attention to what the dealer knew about the factors. Repeat, the objective approach is the court takes into account all other factors without paying attention to what the dealer knew about the factors. It's applicable to a household necessaries, how it's determined whether something is a household necessary. Household necessaries, how it is determined whether something is a household necessary. The case's name is Relumel versus Ramsey. Facts. Factors which have to be taken into account, such as spouse's standard of living, etc. Should court take subjective or objective approach? In this case, it took the subjective approach, viewed from the perspective of the dealer, takes into account the factors of which the dealer was aware, ought to have been aware. The objective approach is the court takes into account all other factors without paying attention to what the dealer knew about factors. It's applicable to household necessaries, how it's determined whether something is a household necessary. The next case is the Maintenance Act 99 of 1998, which is the enforcement of maintenance orders. The case's name is Bannatyne versus Bannatyne. Facts. After divorce, the father accepted to pay maintenance and keep the children on his medical scheme, but failed to pay maintenance, so it went to the maintenance court to reduce the payment amount, and he succeeded, but still failed to make payment and took children off his medical scheme, refusing to pay for their medical cover. The Constitutional Court held that